trends, temperature trends in the basic climate of Maryland, if you're looking for nuts and bolts kind of answers. Climate forecasts are a little trickier. We can do that too, but that's harder than saying what happened in the past. So I hope that's a useful resource for this commission.
Perhaps I could just add a couple of footnotes to that. First of all, just in the increasing precipitation stormwater runoff, you should know that MDE and Maryland are a national leader in that NOAA is taking a look at updating all of the statistics that are used across the US. Maryland was 2 years ahead of other states in putting that together in a collaboration with NOAA. So it is being looked at with some real quality staff that you have there in MDE. The other thing that I would also mention with these heat domes, you're probably aware of the book that came out last week that got a lot of press. It's The Heat That Will Kill You. And I would just highlight the work of Dr. Sokota and our Department of Health that a few years ago produced a really good documentation of the human health consequences. And for those of people who weren't on the commission last year, one of the recommendations which we made was it's time to update that human health consequences. Now we know a lot more about elevated temperatures, what happens in heat islands and things like that. So I would expect that will come forward again this year as part of the EWG recommendations. So with that, I will go, perhaps if we could go to the sea level rise, and I'll make this very brief. First of all, I'll give the apologies for Dr. Don Bosch, and I'll give the history of his involvement in this. Unfortunately, he wanted to give the presentation, but he's on his way down to the Gulf Coast where he's an expert advising on what's happening down there. So he's probably at 36,000 feet now, getting bumped around in some of the turbulence on the way down there. Secondly, Don did give a detailed presentation to the STWG, so that's recorded and available. So I'm just going to touch on the highlights. We're willing to take further questions, and of course, please feel free to reach out to us given the huge implication of sea level rise on everything from that Secretary Belton mentioned saltwater intrusion that Department of Planning are deeply involved in. So this is truly a big deal. So Chris, could we bring up the presentation?
Chris, I think you have access to the screen sharing.
Which sharing?
Are you sharing the screen? Because I have it loaded here as well.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, I don't have that file handy. Thanks.
So this is the full set of projections that have been done for the state of Maryland. The first set was part of a more comprehensive list of recommendations produced by the STWG back in 2008. So if we go to the second slide, yep. That was updated in 2013 based on methodology that was developed by the National Academy of Sciences.
Chris, could you also share it out?
Sorry.
Yeah. And so from 2013, the methodology is that was developed by the National Academy of Sciences for the West Coast. This methodology has now been applied more widely through many states, particularly here in the Northeast. And when the General Assembly codified the existence of the Climate Commission, UMCES was given the responsibility of doing this update every 5 years, and we've continued to do that through the Science and Technical Working Group, but we bring in a much broader group. So if we go to the next slide, this lists the expert group. It includes representation from the ARWG, experts from within the states, and just to highlight a couple there, Professor Bakker. When we were talking earlier about combination of risks to understand different events coming either together or sequentially, Dr. Bakker really is one of the leaders nationally. He did the risk assessment for the Gulf Coast amongst many other studies around the world. A couple of other highlights there, a name very familiar, to many is Dr. Robert Kopp from New Jersey. Yes, he is the son of our former treasurer. He is literally a world leader on climate change, in particular sea level rise, and it's his models which are used by this working group. So this is a very high level, both of the experts within the state, but also you'll see there people that have been publishing and on the cutting edge of sea level rise across the US. Next slide. And so sea level rise, we need to consider what's often referred to as relative sea level rise. So this is sea level rise due to the warming of the oceans and the expansion of water, and it's due to ice melt, and it's also due to the ocean circulation. But in addition to that, areas, particularly here in Maryland, are subsiding over time. So you have the combination both of subsidence and sea level rise. So in our state, since 1975, the rate of sea level rise varies between about 4.5 and 5.8 millimeters per year. And the differences around the Chesapeake Bay is dependent on the rates of subsidence. The rate is accelerating over time, as we might expect. And this rate is higher than the global average. It's not as rapid as the Gulf Coast, but it's still higher than many other places in the US and around the world. If we go to the next slide. The recording for STWG goes into this in a lot more detail. This analysis was based on the IPCC 6th assessment, which we reported out to the Commission last year. And it looks at a range of emission scenarios from this. And just very briefly, it looks at scenarios for if the Paris Climate Accord was achieved. It looks at what are called the current NDCs, the nationally defined contributions. These are the voluntary contributions. Unfortunately, most countries haven't got close to their NDCs yet, but this is a second scenario. And then there's a high level emission, assuming that emissions do not plateau, but continue to rise over time. Next slide. And so in this summary, this just gives the rates of sea level rise. There isn't much difference between the emissions scenarios between now and 2050 because there's so much lag in the system. But what happens after 2050 is extremely sensitive to the rates of global emission, as this slide shows. So what the group decided to do was to look at the most plausible, the most likely outcome, and put error bounds on that. So if we go to the next slide. So this, for those three scenarios, gives guidance of what's expected. The most plausible one is the one you're on the left. And this gives us a range of between make sure that these numbers are correct, that we can expect by the turn of this century, that we could expect an increase of about 0.82 of a meter. So that's a little less than 3 feet. However, depending on the emissions scenario, and the other big uncertainty is how the cryogenic or the poles and Greenland ice sheets break up. It could be significantly higher than that. But the recommendation is the best estimate is going to be about 0.82 of a meter with a range, as is given here, between about 0.65 and 1.2 meters. The group also made the recommendation, as was done last time, to work with Maryland Sea Grant with funding from NOAA to make these recommendations useful and practical for local government and state agencies. And so, led by DNR and Maryland Sea Grant, later this year, these recommendations are going to be turned into practical recommendations to local government and those people responsible for land use planning. So you'll also see in the report that the committee called out Governor Moore's comments to take immediate action to begin to mitigate and adapt to the effects of sea level rise. So I think we're very fortunate in this state to you have the science to have this regular update, but also for DNR and MDE and the Department of Planning to then see the next steps to see how this science information can be brought rapidly to decision making. So with that, I will happy to take questions.
Thank you. Well, first, really appreciate your presentation, and this really does highlight everything that we're doing and why reducing emissions and all the goals and everything that we're trying to do is so important. It's like a ripple effect. You don't fix this, then you get more problems over here. Sea level rise is really, really a really important issue for Maryland, for everybody, everywhere, really. But yeah, thank you for that. And I think it'd be good if we could have a quick conversation about this conversation. Who would like to start? I know there's a lot in planning, and I know you talked about the planning part of it. So
Are you
here
running
to share some thoughts.
Are you running scenarios where you show the models like, i.e. like Manhattan and other places did in terms of sort of visualizing it? Because I feel like, and to Mark's earlier point, I mean, I think for us to be able to help make this relevant to localities, we need pictures. I mean, we need to get beyond metrics and measurements to sort of visual representation of this is what that looks like. And here's how it looks that way if we follow this set of assumptions. Like, for instance, I know that scientists working around consensus are very conservative. So the assumptions are actually very, very low comparative to the reality of the potential of the you know, the sheet loss, the ice sheets in Greenland. We look at the extremes, and we're able to simulate that. Is that work being done?
So, of course, this is just one part of it. This
Right.
is the baseline that gives the range. So you could pick any of these scenarios.
Right.
Really, how that's used depends on the application. So the water gets deeper. More wave energy hits the shoreline. There's accelerated shoreline.
Right.
The water gets deeper. There's more nuisance flooding. There's more saltwater intrusion. So there are modeling going on both at the Chesapeake Bay program and within the various institutions that are looking, you know, at various scenarios. So, for example, the historic Hurricane Isabel was looked at under these sea level scenarios. And there's some wonderful visualization as well as the economic analysis of the increasing costs associated with sea level rise. So there's a lot of these pieces around that are looking at specific problems, but I agree with you. It would be really good to have these kinds of tools available beyond. NOAA does have some very nice online.
I've seen those maps.
So they're
Right.
great. But for these specific things that brings it down to the local government level, I think that would be a great.
Because I think
thing
that's
to
our
see.
challenge of sort of how do we be able to communicate to what does this mean to a person today and their grandchildren? And how do we create a way of really making that more relevant to them directly? And what is the domino effect? So I really put that out there to everyone of sort of, we get it, but how do we help others down the path of really connecting those dots and really, you know, understanding the variety of things that really are in their everyday life of scenario A, B, and C. People can choose whichever scenario they want. I know which one I choose. When those ice sheets melt, you know, we're in trouble. But I think that's what it's going to take to be able for us to work with the local governments to think about what does that mean to your comp plan or your zoning or your development practices, that we really need to be helping create model approaches to how do we create better forms now.
I think that's, I couldn't agree more. And also for the individual landowner.
Right.
Or homeowner to plan generations into the future if you're in a vulnerable area. And I think the CRAB, which MDE produced, the Climate Ready Action Boundary, goes some of the way towards that. But there are other scenarios which could certainly be included given the sophistication of the models which we have out there.
Right. Well, thank you for your work. I think we just had to figure out how to make it relevant and what action we can be taking.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And building on the point the Secretary just made, I appreciate in the one pager on sea level rise at the end, talk about how different points of the spectrum of projected sea level rise maybe should be used in planning. Say that median estimates of sea level rise are more appropriate for nature-based adaptation, whereas for infrastructure investments providing essential community services worth more than an estimated 50-year lifespan, sea level projections with a low probability of exceedance should be used. So that sort of gives a range of how, as we plan, state and local governments make investments, perhaps, you know, what points on the spectrum of potential sea level rise should be used in planning.
Yeah, exactly.
Did I understand you to say that, for the first 50 years, it's plateaued, it's fine. It's when you're looking beyond 50 years, 2050,
Or actually, to clarify that, up until 2050,
2050,
all
okay,
of whichever scenario you look at, there's very little difference statistically.
up until 2050.
So we know through 2050 with a reasonable certainty what the sea level rise is going to be, even if there was rapid ice fail. But beyond 2050, that's where the lines really begin to diverge dramatically.
And even more when emissions are not being reduced.
Yeah, that's,
It makes it even worse.
and there you could be looking at double the
Right.
sea level rise.
I think that's a real takeaway for us too.
The ice sheets.
Yeah.
But regardless, between now and 2050, there is sea level rise, right? It's just that
Yes.
our estimate is much
Yeah.
that's our confidence.
Yeah, to follow up. Some of our infrastructure is built for more than 25 years, obviously, which gets for 27 years against 2050. And I'm thinking of roads, and I don't want to step on the Secretary redeveloped area. And I think on the Eastern Shore, for example, roads or widening or expansion that are on the drawing board, which hopefully will last 50 or 100 years or however long the lifespan is, really come into play, you know, and I've been through a few areas where there are dips on 404 where it does flood now, and, you know, they've done some widening and we don't know what's going to happen when those diverge in 2050. So I think in the long-term view, in multiple areas of infrastructure, which the Secretary alluded to, it's not too late to start thinking about that in terms of whether we have to raise our roads, for example. And as we start doing that, not knowing which of these scenarios is going to play havoc actually by 2050. And you know, you don't want to build infrastructure that's going to be destroyed or disabled, you know, by 2060. When the state starts to build money and some of these proposals that are already in the queue, which have a long life cycle.
If I could just add, I mean, picking up Secretary Flores, you know, you start to visualize this, particularly with the more conservative, just to 2050, what that means for infrastructure. I mean, I was just down in St. Mary's County and we're looking at raising a road there 10 inches, right? Because of this. But is that our path forward, right? And it's not only in, you know, when you think of Lower Eastern Shore or Southern Maryland, but I know when I was at Metro, it's a very large issue for Metro and some of those tunnels and some of those stations. And again, to visualize that and it's visualized so that we can do things, but it's probably more important to motivate, you know, action from a broader community. right? Because again, us around this table can wrestle with this, but until we get this broader understanding of this issue, as we have to make these hard decisions that, well, we're not going to invest in that because it is in effect, putting money where we can't sustain it, or sustain the infrastructure that we're building, is really the debate, I think, that we need to have. And so I think the more we visualize this for people to broaden that debate, I think is, to all of our self-interest, clearly from a transportation perspective.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have a new system. I'm gonna put this up when it's time to move on. That way I won't interrupt you. Okay, so kind of look at this. This is up. It means I'm moving on. Okay. All right. That was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any last words?
Yeah, could I just make one closing comment, and it's extremely relevant, but most of you know this will be my last commission meeting. I'm stepping down at the end of September, but I did want to introduce my colleague, Dr. Bill Dennison, who's a world-renowned seagrass expert, particularly with the effects of climate change. But also, most importantly, it was his group under the Vice President of Science Applications that put together the Coastal Resilience Report Card with DNR and the agencies, that is looking at this, how are we doing in terms of coastal resilience? What should the state be prioritizing? So it's very relevant for me to finish. Dr. Dennison's at the back. Please welcome him and treat me as warmly as you have over the last few years. But Bill will be here from beginning of October onwards.
Bill, we're so thrilled to have you a part of the commission. You've done great work. We all are very familiar with you and your work. So welcome, and sorry to see you with us as well. But we understand you do better things. Yes. All right. Thank you again. And we look forward to your leadership as well. All right, we're going to move on.
Okay, so the next item on the agenda is a briefing for the commission on the June pathway. Sabrina, would you mind joining us at the table? So we will give a brief presentation on working from June. Bring here. Here we go. Okay, thanks everyone. So MDE will kick it off and then we'll turn to our partners at the University of Maryland to go over the analysis. So this is about the June 30th pathway report, the report that lays out a pathway to our 2031 GHG goal. So first, a little bit on the timeline and where we are now. And everyone in the room should have a printed copy of this presentation in front of you. So back in June, we released the pathway report. The Climate Solutions Now Act gave us a June 30th deadline. So we released that back in June, and it's that report, generally speaking, is an assessment of how Maryland can achieve its GHG reduction goals. Now, in the summer and fall, we're in the midst of statewide outreach to get public input on the pathway and on what the state should consider as we establish policies to achieve the pathway. And then in December, under the Climate Solutions Now Act, we have our final plan due, and that will lay out how Maryland will achieve our goals. So the June report said, here's how Maryland can achieve its goals, and by December, we have to decide how we will do so. And the report is a partnership between MDE and the University of Maryland, with, of course, lots of support and collaboration from our sister agencies. UMD's Center for Global Sustainability is a global center of expertise on this topic, and so we're really fortunate that they were able to partner with us, and we sort of brought the scientists in the tradition of this commission. We put the scientists to work along with the state agencies to figure out what the state should do. So an update on the outreach sessions. We're holding them in every part of the state. We've had 2 so far, one at Bowie State and one just last night in Hagerstown. The next one is a week from Saturday in Salisbury. We'll have an online session for elected officials, and we'll have 2 more in-person meetings, Morgan State and Baltimore, and College of Southern Maryland down in Prince Frederick. And then we'll also have a general online session to close it out. The info and the registration info, all that is on our website, mde.maryland.gov/climate change. We welcome members of the commission who attend those meetings. We find that they're extremely helpful conversations to go directly out into public meetings and hear about the challenges that people see from their perspective. Yeah.
Chris, just a clarification. You said on September 9th, the College of Southern Maryland, but then you said Prince Frederick. Is that their Prince Frederick campus?
Prince Frederick campus.
Okay, it might be helpful on the documentation to say that because they have several campuses in different locations.
Thank you very much. Yes. We started the outreach sessions and we have many more to go. We're getting lots of really good feedback. So what is the Maryland Climate Pathway Report? As I mentioned, it's a partnership between UMD and MDE. We also worked very closely with this commission's mitigation working group. The UMD team checked in just about every month as they were putting it together, as the analysis was being developed, as the model was being built. So we got lots of input from the mitigation working group as we went along. And the pathway includes lots of emissions analysis, establishing a reduction pathway to our 2031 goal, our 60% reduction by 2031 goal. It also includes economic analysis and health benefit analysis associated with that pathway. And so it sort of establishes the pathway and then talks about conceptual policies and programs the state could put in place to put Maryland on that pathway. And so now our goal in the outreach sessions is to hear about that, right? Here are some ideas for how to do it. What do you all think we should do in the December?
And just a reminder that, if you go back, the economic and health benefits analysis that's required as part of the climate solutions.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Okay, so we're joined by Rena from the University of Maryland team to present some of the analytical results.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, it's a really great honor to be here today. I'm Rena Tsui, Research Director, Associate Research Professor at the Center for Global Sustainability. And I also have my two colleagues, Shannon, Bradley, also team of the work here today. Really great to be presenting this work on behalf of the team. We do have a awesome team working on this in partnership with MDE. I think it's been a great honor to have this opportunity to be able to support our state on achieving this ambitious climate goal, which we are all very excited about. So my first slide, just to put some background, I think this is a mission pathway starting with from the base year 2006 for the state, and we're already seeing the greenhouse gas emission declining as of today. Between the base year and today. But the Climate Solution Now Act last year also included a very ambitious climate target, the 60% reduction by 2031, and also net zero emission by 2045. So the Maryland Climate Pathway Report, as Chris already introduced, illustrate in very detailed, a lot of detail, the report you may already see in it's like 100 pages. One possible pathway, so it's not the only one, but one possible pathway to how we can achieve those climate goals through a very well vetted, unique modeling approach, which our center is really specialized in. It's a global integrated assessment model with 50-state disaggregation of the United States, GCAM USA, that has been applied in global, national, state level context in different ways. So this is a first kind of report that present the path that can deliver economic, social, and environmental benefits to all Marylanders. While the report mainly focus on 2031 goal, we also look at the net zero 2045. Just to make sure we are, the near-term action are also put us in a pathway that are in line with the long-term goal. So I think the presentation will focus on 2031, but just want to make that point. We did look at the longer term as well. Next slide, please. So to do this, we modeled two scenarios. Current policy, which include everything on the books, from the state and federal to quantify how close do we get already with all the existing policies. And then the Maryland climate pathway scenario layer in additional policy on top of existing ones to reach the climate goals. So the two charts you're seeing are the emission reduction pathways across all the sectors under each of the two scenarios, and the colors are different sectors. So it's really a comprehensive analysis that covers opportunities across all the sector. Some of the summary high-level numbers on the left. So to achieve the 2031 goal, we need a total of emission reduction of 73.3 million metric ton between 2006 and 2031. And as of 2020, we already achieved half of those, 36.7 million metric ton. And then the current policy can deliver additional 26 million metric ton by 2031, equivalent to 51% reduction from the base year, which leaves us another 10.6 million metric ton as a gap to achieve the 60% goal, which require additional policy to do that. Just quickly comment on the beyond 2031. So we do see negative emissions are needed when we talk about net zero, because that there are some hard to abate emission residues that are left in the system, which will require some negative emission to offset from the system. And we see that starting to ramp up beginning in 2035, indicating some of the technologies may not be ready yet today, need some innovation, for example, the carbon removal technologies. Next slide, please. So this is a 2031 goal presented in a different way. So starting with the far left, we're seeing the base year emission level. And then to the far right, we have the 2031 goal where we need to get to. And with the emission reduction already happened as the second bar on the left, the green piece, that's get to us the 2020 level. And then for the rest of the bars, it shows the emission reduction from individual sector that can be achieved. And using the electricity sector as an example, you can also see the bar is shaded in two, it's colored in two shades. The lighter shade at the top represents reduction delivered by current policy. And then the darker shade on the bottom is the additional reduction that can be achieved with a policy that we modeled in the Maryland climate pathway. So in the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through each of the different sectors that you're seeing on this summary slide. Next. Yeah, starting with electricity sector, which will deliver 89% reduction under the climate pathway by 2031. There's already a lot of activities or opportunities going on. So in addition to the current policy that we modeled, RPS, planned coal retirement, renewal of nuclear license, and also RGGI target, federal IRA tax credits. What's get to us to the 2031 goal will require enhanced ambition in the following areas, including a 100% clean electricity by 2035. That's an enhanced ambition from the existing RPS, and also require collaborate across Maryland and with neighboring states, which enhance the RGGI target to 0 by 2040, which you can see also on the graph. On the graph, we show the emission reduction from the current policy in the dashed line, but the area shows you the emission reduction of the climate pathway in more detail. So the imported part representing what we modeled on RGGI that also goes to 0 by 2040. Next slide, please. Yeah, moving to transportation sector, that would deliver 49% reduction by 2031, which we didn't break out, but we can see from our model, the on-road vehicle sector contribute to majority of the reduction. The policies that we included for the existing policy run, including the advanced clean car to ACC2, advanced clean trucks, IRA tax credits, IIJA infrastructure funding, CAFE standard. But what we see in addition to that, to deliver the Maryland climate pathway, we really need to further reduce vehicle miles traveled through smart roads, and also mode switching that it will be consistent with current emission in some of the other leading states. We also need to ensure access to state and federal incentives to enable all of the targets to be delivered. And further ambition will be delivered by adopting the California Clean Fleet Regulation, which has 100% EV sales by 2045. And then in the bus sector, achieving 100% electric buses by 2025. And of course, the non-road source are, although it's small compared to the road sector, it will be also important to focus on if we want to achieve a broader target. Next slide, please. And the building sector, we're seeing 35% reduction by 2031 under the climate pathway. Again, not break in this graph, but we see residential sector contribute larger emission reduction than the commercial building sector. And you can see in the graph, a lot of the emissions currently are from natural gas consumption, but it will be decreasing over time, even with current policy, which include Empower, BEPS, IRA tax credits, and rebates. In addition to that, for the Maryland climate pathway that indicated by the area chart, we will also need enhanced ambition in terms of zero emission appliances that can also deliver the air quality and health benefits, safety benefits for indoor air quality. This will be in line with the San Francisco Bay Area standard. Another strategy, including the zero emission construction standards that will be setting all client sales 100% electric by 2030. And then the third bullet is to extended energy efficiency standard beyond the current 27 timeline through 2050. Next slide. Moving on to industrial sector, you can see this compared to other sector, there's actually a larger gap between the dashed line and the area between the two scenarios. So the current policy that are modeled, including the IRA hydrogen tax credits, 45Q credits for CCUS, what we modeled under the climate pathway, including the Buy Clean standard to increase electrification efficiency, CCUS in the industry sector, which will also in line with Unreal's analysis on the high rapid 2050 electrification scenario in their analysis. We also will also have the fuel switching from coal to natural gas in in one of our cement facilities. In another facility, it also have some opportunity to switch that to biofuel in the total fuel mix. This will, the additional policy that we modeled will actually require removing the manufacturing sector exemption that kind of currently the sector are exempted from the Climate Act, which in our climate pathway, we'll have a different, different path. Next slide, please. For the industrial processes and product use sector, we see 46% reduction, which include the current regulation from the AIM Act and also the state-owned regulation on HFC, 45Q credits. The emission reduction are really delivered from two parts. One is the F-gases regulation that reduce emission from the ODS, which is the ozone depleting substances, large share of the emissions, and also have the cement process emissions that will need to reduce through CCUS, because this is like really hard to abate source of emissions. Which again, kind of go back to the point about some of the innovation technology will need to be think about today. Next slide, please. The fossil fuel sector, most of the emission are coming from the methane emission in natural gas production. The key policy included are the Maryland gas methane regulation already in place, and then the IRA methane fee that apply to two of the facilities in Maryland. So for the Maryland pathway, I think it's really important to have the monitoring of natural gas infrastructure in place. And a lot of the reduction you see, the difference are actually from the reduced natural gas use, because we're seeing all the activities or actions happen in the other sector, the end use sector, and that's the part where deliver the difference, not from additional like a targeted policy on methane control. Next slide. On the waste management sector, the current policy we modeled, including Maryland landfill regulation, but we do have additional reduction that will from the further increase the recycling and waste diversion away from landfill. Improving access to composting will enable some of the actions need technology infrastructure to support that. Next slide, please. In the agriculture sector, it delivered 9% reduction under the climate pathway. We already assume it implements some climate smart agricultural practice to offset the change in livestock population. And there's no current policy scenario for livestock, but we assumed the methane mitigation potential from the EPA's marginal abatement cost curve that has the low cost opportunity or zero cost mitigation opportunity for the livestock sector in Maryland, which delivered additional reduction. Last sector is forestry and land use. I think this is important, very important sector that can deliver negative emission, which may not be too relevant for 2031, given the goal is gross emission, but it will be very important for net zero, which covers all the sectors and the gases. So currently we are holding that constant at the 2020 level, but I think we will incorporate a more detailed analysis for this in the future that incorporate a trajectory. It's very important to protect the forestry and protect the land and make sure the negative emissions are will be delivered. Next slide. Yeah. The last policy, I think in the model, we see there are some hard to abate emissions through the suite of policy that we presented earlier. which we in the model implement a cap and invest program, which is a market-based mechanism that applied to all the sector, deliver the 4% emission reduction, the remaining gap to the 2031 goal. I think just to maybe add a few notes to that, I think this is a modeling exercise that we see. There's the kind of a 4% gap that can be covered by the cap and invest program. But I think that this is really also an opportunity to use that mechanism to reinvest some of the capital in areas that really need innovation and also provide financial support to local communities. But I think it's also uncertain about, pathways, how much the other policies can deliver. So we are not using it as a last minute kind of approach to fill in the gap. But it's just to think of that as an opportunity to help direct some of the investment. I think next slide is a summary. This is really a summary of what we already seen on the emission reductions from all the individual sector under the two scenarios, current policy and climate pathway. Some key points, we see the largest reduction come from the electricity sector, where a lot of existing policy already but to go to beyond and deliver the addition, there are several policy opportunities we discussed. And then transport sector reduction is the largest in terms of the absolute emission reduction amount, but relatively in terms of percentage is smaller than some of the other sectors. And also want to emphasize even for some of the smaller sectors with smaller reductions, it will be important to meet the ambitious goal, because we already see there's we need to navigate all the possibilities to deliver that. Next slide. In addition to the greenhouse gas emission reduction, we also introduced at the beginning, we also assess the quantify the benefits beyond just greenhouse gas emission reduction in the report. We coupled with two other models, the REMI model on economic impact and also EPA's COBRA on health benefits to better understand what are the additional benefits that with this pathway, which we do see a substantial improvement in health through improved air quality, reducing respiratory ailment for our vulnerable populations and co-workers. This will deliver an equivalent of $1.09 to $2.44 billion in the health benefits by 2031. And also in terms of economic benefits, it will drive a lot of job creation. More than 16,000 new jobs will be created by 2031, and personal income increase of nearly 1.5 billion by that time. With that, I think the last slide, you also have that in the back of your card. I think it's a really nice summary of everything covered in the card, with a lot of opportunities for each of the sector. Many of them already happening today, but successful implementation will be the key to deliver. I think we also highlight this all-in or all of society approach in the center, which just want to kind of emphasize we really need the entire state to work together with all the levels of government, business, private sector, local community, all the Marylander to be able to deliver this goal. So I think the public comments period or outreach period are collecting information on that and getting input and also your input about how this can be achieved. So I think I will end there. Just want to open it up for questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rena. I think we have a question, Director Pinsky.
Yeah, I may have a few. If you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Let's go to the transportation what page. I don't know if they're numbered. On a number of these charts, a pretty significant decrease from 2025 to 2030. 2025 is a year and a half away. So let's start with the transportation sector. The first bullet is smart growth and zoning reform to reduce vehicle miles traveled. Well, we're a year and a half away from this radical decline. And I'm not sure what policies we're talking about. In other words, I know the Secretary of Planning, would like to intensify where there's growth and keep rural spaces. But I'm not sure if there's policies on the books or what the University of Maryland is recommending to actually reduce vehicle miles traveled. I mean, this has been an issue for lots of years. And obviously, there is some shift to ZEVs. Obviously, some people are hesitant because of infrastructure and charging, and we would all like that to go more quickly. The projection over the next 18 months, 2025, is modest. It's modest. So I'm a little perplexed as to how we're going to start seeing a radical decline and savings in the transportation sector, particularly. I just don't see this concrete strategies of reducing vehicle miles traveled. And as much as I want to have even more smart growth policies in place, I'm not sure I see them happening in the next 24 months. So these are all sort of related. So I'm going to just mention one or two more questions. So if we go to the next page, the building sector, once again, from 2025 to 2030, you see a fairly significant reduction. And I'm unclear what the policy is of moving from natural gas to electrification. Look, I love having a growth in zero emissions appliances, but that's not going to count for the kind of reduction that I see in this chart. So again, I don't know what the specific policies the University of Maryland is recommending in terms of moving towards electrification in the building sector, particularly commercial. And I'm going to repeat myself one more time. In the industrial sector, again, it doesn't go down in 25. Well, yes, has significant decline 25 to 30. And I know we talked about fuel switching. And finally, if you go to the fossil fuel sector, the reduction, it says reduce natural gas use, and 25 to 30 is only a modest reduction. So I'm trying to see how these parts fit together, where we're only going to have a modest reduction in fossil fuel sector, but when we look at the consumption in transportation, in buildings, we have a radical decline. And I guess I'm trying to understand what policies, the actual policies, the on-the-ground policies are going to be to get us there. So I understand the 30,000 foot, and I appreciate it. And I don't mean to be skeptical, although I might be a little. But I'm just trying to understand how this is going to work and how it's going to fit.
So I can start, and then maybe Rini can fill in any modeling specific answers. So for the transportation sector, the really steep declines are mostly from vehicle electrification. And so you see that the dotted line, existing policies, includes those steep declines. That's because existing policies include advanced clean cars too. It includes advanced clean trucks. It includes really substantial policy changes that, as of the time of the report, the state had already decided to do. So they counted in the current policy scenario. BMT reduction is obviously critically important, but especially the near-term declines are largely from transitions to electric vehicles as we look at the adoption curve under the plan, hopefully following that new technology exponential growth. And then this is how that manifests in the on-road emissions.
without getting, look, I don't want to get the weeds, Chris, or, what kind of projections and growth are we assuming in terms of, electric vehicle over the next 6 years?
So I believe for passenger vehicles, we modeled compliance with advanced lane cars too. And then for I believe the scenarios that included some of the trading and flexibility elements. So it wasn't meeting the total top line advanced lane cars to percentage requirements in the near term years. It was assuming manufacturers take advantage of some flexibility provisions in that regulation, that in the nearer term. For advanced clean trucks, same idea. We followed the sales requirements in those regulations, accounting for some of the flexibilities built into those programs that allow some smoothing in the first years where the programs take effect.
And Rena, about the building sector, can you talk to that?
Maybe I'll throw one out there that's really big in the building sector, BEPS. As you know, BEPS requires 20% reduction in on-site emissions, which is what this graph is showing for covered buildings by 2030, right, from 2025 to 2030.
Right, but, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, the 20% reduction in buildings over 35,000 square feet, that doesn't account for all this reduction. So then the assumption is buildings below 35,000 square feet, and I know there's a work group that we're co-chairing. So the expectation is there will be policy for other buildings, commercial and residential, that are going to have to meet certain standards.
Exactly. And so the dotted line here reflects what's already there, including all the federal incentives, right? So there are now really substantial federal incentives for homeowners to electrify. And then to get from the dotted line down to the colorful areas are all the additional investments programs that the state has to put in place. Things like the appliance standards and construction standards, and more incentives for homeowners and smaller commercial buildings to electrify.
And does that, for example, include replacing HVAC systems running on gas to heat pumps?
Yes, exactly that. Yeah.
Okay. Sure.
And I think the point you brought up about how the numbers have to start moving right away, because 2031 is basically tomorrow, I think is like the urgency we face in getting those programs and funding in place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Follow up on what Director Pinsky said. I know that the initial report had more detail about some of these specific policies, but I agree with the director that'd be helpful to get a little bit more detail about what these recommendations entail, and also maybe what they contribute to the actual bending of the curve. My last and one other question, Chris, just to follow up with something you said about adoption of incentives, federal incentives. I guess in the building sector, does this assume sort of fairly standard adoption? You know, Maryland is average in terms of adoption of the incentives for electric appliances, for example, conversion of HVAC, hot water systems, et cetera.
Well, there's a modeling answer to that, which is that the model is calibrated to Maryland, right, and to our existing data about adoption rates in Maryland. And then the model sort of estimates how that changes when there are federal incentives available, for example, that change the cost picture, the different technologies. Like Rena can say in more detail.
Yep. Then I think in the additional policy, because we're layering in the zero emission appliance, zero emission construction targets, and then the IRA will also play an enabling kind of a policy of providing economic incentive to achieve those targets.
I'll just add before we go on, there's case studies, I'll call them, like in California, where you can see when you have these incentives, when you use IRA funding, when you tie policies to certain projections, you can actually see the growth. Like, for example, with electric vehicles in California, with advanced clean cars too, and advanced clean trucks, you could clearly see with that policy, the numbers went up in terms of, electric vehicle purchases and reductions in emissions. So it's, and I think that's what you're asking for, and you, the side by side. What is it? Which policy creates this?
Right.
And I think, isn't that kind of what you're looking for, the correlation of, you say go up, you say do this, but which policy ties to it? And what's that projection
Right.
precisely going up?
I think we had other question.
Oh, yes, you and then, I'm sorry, he had his hand up first. Which,
I'm wondering if where or if there is a margin of safety built into the projections. Does every shot have to go through the hoop here? Or I know adaptive management is part of this over time, but could you speak to any buffers or margins of safety in the analysis?
I think I'll start in prior versions of the plan, we've always done that. We've tried to overshoot to have that margin of safety. Our goals are so ambitious in this case that we had to reach basically everything to get to them. So this pathway does not include any excess quantitatively.
and that I want to emphasize, there is no wiggle room. Let's just be none, no wiggle room. It's, I mean, if we did nothing today, just stop, just continue the path with the current policies that we have. We would reach the goals by 50%. No, we would reach 51, or is it 51? 51% of that goal. We would be at 51% instead of 60. If we did nothing else today, just follow what we're doing. So that's a big gap. And so that's aggressive, right? To get to 60. So there is no, I'll say it again, there is no wiggle room. We're going to call on actually Kim, and then you, Paul, and then Mark. Kim, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Secretary. And you set up my comments pretty well here, because the way I read this report, and congratulations to University of Maryland for doing excellent work. I mean, really what we have presented to us right now is almost the math, right? It's not the policies. What we are being told, as the Secretary has emphasized here, is that we have to do everything, and we have to do everything perfectly. Now, that's not happening. One of the things I think that we have to emphasize in this report is that the current policies are not being implemented as described in this math presentation. And so further in the report, there's the whole low implementation scenario, which I think actually is reality. And so what is ahead of us is daunting. We have to do everything perfectly, and we're not even doing everything, let alone doing it perfectly right now. So the other aspect of this is the whole cap and invest assumption, and the funding and the federal funding that is assumed in this scenario, which the state is not obtaining as it needs to be. So my question for somebody out there, and I don't, I hate to throw you under the bus, Chris, but if, what happens now? Like, isn't this work that is ahead between now and the end of December, isn't that really the focus of what we need to be talking about? I know the rest of the meeting is on funding, but this is not the end point. This is giving us some numbers from which we then need to make these tough decisions and look at the legislators, look at the administration, look at the funding mechanisms, because as Dr. Goodwin started out with, it's coming, right? The sea is rising here for Maryland, and we have to do these actions. So I'll get off my high horse, but I'm worried.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I'll do my best. I agree. You said that's the task we have ahead, right? Here's the math on what we have to accomplish, right? And so now we have to have make those tough decisions about what we're actually going to do, not just for the future policies, but also to implement the current policies. A big focus of this commission has been the areas where the state is struggling, right? Like getting sufficient scaled solar deployment. That was a big topic in the last year and a half. So, I mean, my suggestion from staff in terms of where the commission to focus its work is, as the planning process is going to continue through December, we want all of your input, but the commission could structure its recommendation this year about those things that we know we already need to do to achieve those current policies. And we've talked about that a bit. And one of them is, the next agenda topic, which is getting funding sources in place. One of them is addressing the barriers to solar deployment that are one of the pain points that Kim was mentioning earlier. So that's my suggestion.
Okay, thank you. So we're gonna try to get through the 3 more people, and then we're gonna move on to funding. Cole, and then you, Mark? You're Mark? Okay, Mark, Dave, and there's one other person on, and
David Last.
you can see that person's name.
Oh, it's David Last.
David, and then I think I just saw your hand.
I did, but I know you.
All right, so can you just keep your comments kind of short so we can?
Very quickly on the VMT, just so I understand, and you don't give an answer, but obviously the travel behavior since post-COVID, how does that play into this?
Oh,
And particularly reduction in transit usage in our major metropolitan areas. And whether or not that's ever coming back or not, who knows? The other is, the nature of Maryland with all the pass-through traffic and the people that O&D in and out of the state every day. So as we think of policies, the reality is our neighbors may not be doing the same policies, but the reality is our economy, our, everything that, is the reality is that either go through us or they come in from Pennsylvania, go to work and leave, or Virginia or Delaware. Because I know that's a big issue for us. For instance, when we look at the Bay Bridge, we're dealing with Virginia, Delaware people, West Virginia people, Pennsylvania people, right? And so, we can't control their desires and the impact they have on us. So, and I don't know if that's anywhere incorporated in the model. Maybe it is, but it's just a real factor in a state like ours.
very true.
Maybe a short answer is your team was very helpful in us coordinating on BMT assumptions. So there was very close collaboration between the modelers and the team. All of our BMT projections, we always want the 2 agencies to match it.
But on that, just very small, federal government is now encouraging people to come back to work in the federal government. There may be the same move on the state level, which is being determined as we speak. And if greater number of people go to work, it means small businesses, people who have small businesses, may also increase their driving. So there are other factors.
Yeah, well, the VMT can go up. We don't know, right? And then the other big, as we've heard it through commerce, is to focus on manufacturing and where the industry is going, and where they want these big manufacturing plants, right? Where they need lots of land to do that throughout the state.
I think we have to be realistic on that modeling on vehicle miles traveled because of that. I mean, we saw COVID, we saw a drastic decrease. Is that realistic? I mean, like you said, telework policies are bringing people back. People want to be in their cars. That's just how it is. So we do have to be realistic when we think about that. You're next.
Thank you very much. To paraphrase what Kim was saying online a few minutes ago, it's a very ambitious plan and we all need to stand shoulder to shoulder to get there. And Maryland counties want to do that with the state agencies, to make that happen. But everything has to work and everything has to work perfectly. It's very daunting. So I'm guessing that there must be some plans in place to monitor the results after all the plans and policies are in place, until we reach the end of our timeline, to make sure those policies are working perfectly. And if they aren't, then we have to adjust again moving forward. But at the same time, if Maryland is a leader nationally in this effort, and our nation is a leader globally in this effort, and we're kind of depending on a rosy scenario, if you will, to get there, then maybe from a local government and state DGS, Nelson, standpoint, we have to plan out your budgets for buildings that we want to last 50 to 100 years from now, right? To deal with the climate of 50 to 100 years from now instead of the climate of 50 years ago, then it's probably wise for us to plan not on climate impacts at the lower end of the range that Dr. Goodwin was pointing out earlier, but to plan on expenses for buildings and infrastructure that are going to have to withstand the climate impacts at the top of the range of those changes. That just seems to be a message we ought to be understanding and putting forward in our literature and committee meetings and discussions as we move forward. From a practical standpoint, our government, state and local need to plan on the top of the range rather than the bottom of the range for those climate impacts.
Couldn't agree more. And I think that is something as we're thinking about.
Because there's a big expense involved with
It is.
difference.
It is. It's really much. It a lot. And when we're thinking about recommendations down the line, as we think about all of these things, we do have to look at, back to what Kim said and you, which policies are we not even doing today? We need to point that out first and make sure we are clear on what those are and see what we can do to get moving on those or just analyze that piece of it. Thank you so much. Now, Dave, you're up.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Secretary. I'll be brief because I know we got the funding conversation. It kind of bleeds into that because I think for me, the implementation of our existing policies is a really critical point. And so in terms of the commission and the December plan that's coming out, can we anticipate from MDE additional details on some of those ancillary policy tweaks to help with the implementation for our existing policies? And then what can you mentioned, Chris, the commission can maybe focus a lot of its recommendations on solar deployment, on other implementation pieces. But I also know that we don't really, as the commission, we don't put our report out till November, right? And you have a report due at the end of December. So how can we assist that? I know the mitigation working group talks about this a lot, and so there's some constant feedback there, but are there other ways that the commission can be supportive of you all over the next 6 months to drill into those implementation recommendations that hopefully will be in the final report? So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I think given the timelines, I just suggest the commission focus on what we know we need to do now rather than what's part of a planning process that's going to conclude 6 weeks later, right? I mean, like we know we've got these immediate challenges ahead of us. There are things that we don't need to wait for another plan to know they do. So that's suggestion.
Thanks.
Thank you. So Dave is virtual and then Rebecca, and then we're gonna move to the next topic. Don't forget, when you see this, go wrap up your comment.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate all the work on this. I would just want to sort of repeat what Kim said, that, you know, we're talking math here, not policies. And from the perspective of what's going on with the utilities in the state, we have, right now, we have 5 gas proceedings before the state. We have 3 gas rate cases. We have 2 gas stride proceedings. Really, Baltimore Gas and Electric's case is also a stride proceeding. And in all those proceedings, we are seeing a continuation of the status quo in terms of significant investments in fossil fuel infrastructure, not consistent with the policies we're talking about here in terms of reductions in gas consumption. And these are having big impacts on ratepayers. And as we go talking about looking at funding strategies, I think we have to take a hard look at how much ratepayers, utility customers, are paying for strategies that are not consistent with the state climate goals, and also look at alternatives other than utility customers as we go forward. Because we've done a number of analyses that show you can look and see how rates are increasing for customers because investments are being locked in today. So not only do we have to look at continuing continuing some of that spending, which in some cases is occurring at a much higher rate than utilities are spending on the electric side. So Baltimore Gas and Electric is literally spending at twice the rate on its gas system as its electric system. So we need to take a look at that But we also need to keep all these things in mind as we talk about funding, because a lot of the funding sources, whether it be how we pay for solar, how we pay for energy efficiency funding, often goes back to ratepayers. And that's a regressive way of funding for these public policy goals. So I would encourage everyone to keep that in mind as we go forward and think about how we're funding these different strategies, where we can save money by changing our investment strategies of the utilities, but also looking at alternatives to funding than utility customers. Thank you.
That is so important. Thank you for bringing that up. Is there somebody else?
We're going to the
I know,
secretary.
but I'm asking, is there anybody else?
We have, Nelson at DGS also.
Go
Okay. No, you
I'll defer. I mean, I've got a ton, but I can keep it short or you can.
go ahead.
Okay.
You're right.
I think, first of all, Secretary Wiedefeld kind of responded on the externalities, and I'm going to trust the model. But I have a lot of questions about how do we break out the sectors in terms of market sectors so we can understand that policy of where to get the biggest bang in increment. And I think related to that is the partnerships with the commercial sector in that regard, because I don't have that data, but I need to understand how, if I sort of were to cross correlate this, where's the commercial sector? Because I think there's a couple of things because of the externalities that are unknown around things like commuting patterns, transportation demand management. We should be adding that on there because we don't know where those workforce issues and changes are going and parking. And I think if we add TDM to this whole equation, as a partnership with the commercial sector and really understand also in the building aspect of that, for instance, the commissioning of existing buildings. What are we doing in terms of sort of that whole, because that can be a win-win for the commercial sector in terms of cost savings also. So I'll leave it at that, but I feel like that piece isn't really, there's not enough here for me to feel like I think we could have good win-win policy around that sector.
That's a very good point. Okay, not my best judgment, but I'm gonna let this last person go. Virgil, only promise to keep it very, very short. Who's the next person?
Nelson.
Nelson.
Just a quick note that, from the state's perspective, at least from DGS's perspective, we're typically a building is built for about a 50-year life. And we're incorporating, the current standards to make the buildings as efficient electronically, or I shouldn't say electronic, electrification. We're doing buildings now that are all building design now is aimed towards all electrification without using fossil fuels for heating, air conditioning, and so forth. And we're using current standards and current materials as we move forward in the next, beyond the 50-year life of the current buildings. There will be new standards, new materials that will hopefully make buildings more efficient all the way around as we develop, in the future. But right now we're looking strictly to electrification in all our new construction.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. All right.
Thanks. Okay, so time check. We have 10 minutes left. We traditionally reserve the last 10 minutes for public comment. We have a really good discussion topic, which is how are we going to pay for everything? I'll suggest to the chair and the co-chairs, perhaps we table that one till our next meeting and encourage everyone to review the thought prompter materials we prepared for today.
Okay.
Our next meeting is scheduled for September 21st currently. And so maybe, we can, pick that topic up again at the next meeting. And in the meantime, everyone's homework is to read our beautiful slide with thoughts prepared on how we're going to do that, if that's agreeable.
That's a great idea. Let's do that.
Okay.
Gives you time to think
Nods
about
around the table. Sorry, we ran out of time on that, but we had a lot of really good discussions. So I'd suggest we move now to public comments. So I guess first we'll start online. Did we have anyone online sign up for public comment in the chat box?
Not that I've seen.
Okay. And how about in the room? Do we have any public commenters in the room? All right. Well, then we have 10 minutes, so perhaps we could either give everyone 10 minutes or we could present the slides and then start that. And
If you introduce, you need to be prepared for the discussion.
yeah,
Yeah, okay. You have comments?
Yeah, a quick question. I've done a back of the envelope calculation. And tell me if I'm off base here, but it looks like you need to be at about 50% electric vehicles in 5 or 10 years to meet these aspirations. That's very ambitious. It's very aggressive. Is that the right ballpark?
are you talking sales or stock?
Up on the road?
So for personal vehicles, in the pathway scenario where we hit 50% out around the neighborhood of 2035.
So that's a little farther away, 50% passenger vehicles. Or like 12.
Yeah, and that's sort of consistent with the sales requirement getting up to 100% in 2035. This is the relevant page in the report. Page 44, I think. But you're right. It is either way that the ambition needs to accelerate dramatically.
That's tough. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the quick comment would be, I think that's optimistic, ambitious, aggressive, whatever you want to call it. I think some of the calculations, there may be reason to be optimistic for things like waste, methane emissions. That may be easier, cheaper to implement than putting half of the vehicles on the road. I'm all in favor of electric vehicles from the standpoint of air quality as well as climate, but that's a big, heavy lift. And the methane, I think might be, landfill emissions and such might be reason to be more optimistic about those implementations. That's all.
Thank you for that. All right.
So we can either go through the funding slides quickly and then
Chris,
run away before you guys start talking, or we can continue the existing discussion topic for the remaining time. I think we had Kim.
sorry, Jennifer Mazarahi has had her hand up for quite a while, so I'm thinking you're not seeing that. So I'm just calling attention to that.
Thank you, Kim.
We did
Yes,
see-
thank you. I am quite new and, but I wanted to ask, is there an opportunity for us to revisit these charts so that we can come up with less optimistic charts? Because I'm really concerned about what points other people raise, that some of these charts are not accurate to the implementation of existing policies. And can we really aggressively look for other ways to reduce our emissions? For example, PG County has a fabulous new plan for climate issues in PG County public schools. What are the other opportunities that might be there? Is there an opportunity to revisit these charts and this goal?
So as part of the December plan, we are going to refresh and redo all of the analysis. So that will have fresh, updated scenarios. We had one low implementation scenario in this version. We'll see how much room we have in time and budget to have additional scenarios for the next one. But we definitely hear that getting current implementation right is obviously priority number one.
Great. And then the second piece was this cap and invest. You presented it on the slide as being only 4% of the emissions, but in fact, it's over 40% of the new emissions beyond what's already passed in law. And yet there is no plan and there's no legislation around that. So that is something that the legislature will need to dig into very, very deeply with the administration. It's over 40% of your projected progress in a plan that doesn't exist.
Yeah, every one of these new policies is going to be a really substantial process to get in place. And at this point, we have to decide which of these policies are we pursuing, right? Which of these conceptual policies are going to be in action the state decides to take in December.
Thank you.
All right, any?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Secretary. One question, I was briefly skimming through the slides for the funding conversation, which looks really great. Excited for September discussion around it. One area that I don't see too explicitly called out here is what Commissioner Lapp was discussing about potentially contradictory funding pathways that we're currently on. And if we could have some space in the discussion and some presentation around that. I know the Office of People's Counsel has some information on it, but I think it's even beyond some of the stuff that they put out there. So I'd just be curious if we could have some, if we're putting that off another month and a half, some prep around it would be interesting for us to chat through.
Also, Kathy Magruder has her hand up.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Chris. I'm Kathy Magruder with the Maryland Clean Energy Center. Really pleased to see the information this morning. A couple points I'd like to make, one with regard to investment and one with regard to economics. It was important to hear the suggestion that we need to see visual images of what sea level rise will do to communities, because I think that that is what motivates people to take actions. How does this affect me at my kitchen table? So with regard to investment, understanding what is the investment that will be needed to address and mitigate the impact of climate change at the community level in terms of government capital improvement budgets, and how can we pay for and finance those improvements as we're addressing climate change at the local level. With regard to economics, I want to call attention with the commission to the slide regarding forestry and how important it is for us to protect and manage forests in Maryland because of the carbon capture and source reduction opportunity that they present. But I want to caution that this is not just about keeping trees standing. Everyone needs to understand that forests are a crop in some ways. People who retain forest land, and I know we work closely with Secretary Kurtz's forestry team with the Department of Environment on looking at opportunities for renewable energy from biomass. And that often flies up against the idea of retaining forests for their carbon capture. We really do need to look at forest management and the demand for wood and wood waste products that encourages landowners to retain land in forest production. And I just want to call attention to that with the commission, that sometimes that flies in the face of what is perceived of as an environmental issue by advocates. We're looking at all the opportunities. So those were the 2 points I wanted to make. The economics of forestry are part of this picture. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. And so we'll count that as the public comments. I'm really sorry at time, so I suggest we bring it to a close. To reiterate, we're meeting again next month. We'll talk about funding. We'll follow up with both Davids in the meantime about additional topics for the briefing slides. In the meantime, encourage everybody to review those and figure out how we're going to pay for all this before you come to the next meeting.
Very good meeting. I'm looking forward to seeing you again. I'll just stress again, please do take some time to read over the slides. There are another set of slides that you didn't get, the sea level rise slide. Okay, we're going to make sure you get those. But yes, we have a lot to talk about in September. Look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Secretary Flora, I've been meaning to schedule an appointment to